Hey everybody, it's Julie. Today I'm going to talk about religion in fiction and how it's portrayed with religious characters. Before I get into it, I'm going to say that this is not really so much a how-to as it is a how-to-not, mostly because what I'm seeing in people trying to write religious characters who have not thoroughly studied the culture that this religion is from may make some really basic mistakes. And of course, you want to avoid seeming culturally insensitive, but you also want to avoid having a character whose religious beliefs are just kind of tacked on or are based on misconceptions on the part of the author. And this video was made inspired by a conversation I had with an author who had tried to write a Jewish character and didn't realize that not all people who consider themselves Jewish eat kosher. And they also, I found out in the ensuing discussion, did not realize that people who are Jewish and are very religious Jewish people not only might eat kosher, but of course they will attend certain services, they will speak Hebrew, they have all these other associated things that aren't just about what they can eat and walking around wearing a Star of David, if you know what I mean. This person didn't even realize that a bar mitzvah isn't just a big party when the person having the bar mitzvah turns 13. It actually has to do with a big rite of passage that involves that person having to recite and perform a whole bunch of stuff, and they are demonstrating knowledge, and that it's not just a big party where you get a bunch of presents. So, if you have really no background in this and your only familiarity with it is like passing references in popular culture, then you're probably going to end up writing it wrong. And this is where my advice gets a little murky because it really comes down to ask a person. And that's not always easy to do if you don't have somebody in your life who might be Jewish or might be Muslim if you're writing a Muslim character, or might subscribe to a system of belief that is not necessarily religious but has rules that you don't understand. It's really hard to get an idea of what is like a culture that surrounds a belief or how that manifests in somebody's life if you just kind of look up the core beliefs, just like it would be very difficult for, say, somebody who was unfamiliar with how people in America tend to practice Christianity by reading the Bible. It would be very, very difficult for people to realize how modern people go to church and what their practice of Christianity is like just from reading a religious book. So sometimes it can be very difficult if you don't have the knowledge yourself to be able to puzzle out what is actually going on in people's lives and what is a core religious belief that maybe isn't practiced or isn't practiced how it sounds like. So it really just boils down to trying to find somebody who can test read what you write or maybe talk to you a little bit about living in that culture if you want to write somebody who is similar to the person that you're interviewing. And then there's also websites that you can go to that showcase some interviews with people from diverse backgrounds. So I can link those for you. But I would always consider that to be supplementary, that you should try to have at least one conversation with someone that you trust to help advise you in writing something that you're unfamiliar with, because if you just write it based on something that you saw on TV or something that you've grown up hearing from outside of the culture, you probably will misrepresent it in ways that you can't understand. So I'm also going to branch out into talking a little bit about invented beliefs. So in fantasy worlds, a lot of times you see invented religions that are sometimes more, sometimes less based on existing religions. A lot of times you see some pseudo-mysticism created for fantasy that is heavily based on what is interpreted as paganism or neo-paganism, especially stuff that is rooted also in Native American cultures that are misunderstood wildly. There's this temptation to kind of appropriate those things and turn them into something else that's a fantasy belief. Now, I'm not saying that you can't use inspiration from existing traditions. That's cool. I mean, as long as you're not taking either an amalgamation of traditions and then calling it one specific tradition. You don't want to do that. You don't want to say that your character is from a specific Native American tribe and then ascribe to them beliefs that that tribe does not practice or did not practice in days long past. And you also don't want to incorporate a bunch of stuff from Celtic traditions that are modern exaggerations or something like that, and then call it that or set it in ancient times but with modern interpretations of it. And of course in fantasy and in invented alien cultures and stuff like that, you have to have, like, number one, you have to have a consistent understanding of what these traditions are based on. And you also ought to consider making some variation amongst the people who practice it. In every family and every culture that I've ever come acquainted with, there's a variation even between the generations of the parents and the children. A lot of times the children will either be less strict about their religion, or they may be exploring, they may be questioning. And I think that it's kind of an amateur mistake to write, say, an entire fantasy culture or entire alien species as practicing the same religion and all being in agreement with how it's practiced. I think that realism can really be increased if you take into account how religions and how practices manifest in the world that you live in, and then see if you can kind of make that reflected in the fiction that you write. For one of my webcomics, I have a story where one of the main characters comes from a culture where it's not exactly a religious belief, but they have a cultural belief that no one should ever prepare their own food. And I don't go into detail right away about this. And then when I do explain why it is that they do that, it's basically a cultural value that puts an emphasis on togetherness, and that a culture can't survive if they don't help each other. So they have this belief that you should never make your own food. Somebody else should always prepare your food, and then you trade plates. So and then there's also a common tradition with this alien species that you're supposed to set out one or two bowls for a stranger who might need a meal prepared, and that if you were in a situation where you had nobody to prepare your meal, you could knock at your neighbor's door and they would let you sit at their table, because eating with a stranger is preferable to having to prepare your own food in that culture. But just like in reality, that is rarely invoked. Nobody in the family that I am writing about even remembers anybody actually doing that. It's really more of a symbol than a practice, and that's true in real life. You see a lot of people spouting stuff from biblical verses or whatever that they don't actually practice, and that they're basically following the letter and not so much the actual law. And that takes place in fantasy cultures too, and I just kind of wanted to have an example of that, where the emphasis is really on, like, you made your own food, that's bad, rather than, are you focusing on togetherness? Are you supporting the people in your community in meaningful ways? So that's just kind of a good example. I hope it's a good example for you on kind of showing how you can use your understanding of reality to incorporate into made-up cultures. So, other than that, I would just like to add a note that I touched on this earlier about appropriation, but be really careful about adapting existing cultures into something for fantasy or something for science fiction, because it really can come across as very insensitive and offensive. And it's not just because like this is an understanding of like, you know, PC culture, that you shouldn't do this is bad or something, but it really is upsetting if this is a culture that you are part of, or this is a religious practice that you value, and then you're seeing somebody kind of take something that is obviously from what you believe, but kind of grafting it onto something else so that the little pieces and parts of it that make it recognizable are becoming part of something that they were never supposed to be part of. And I feel like as writers, we should be able to do better than that. We should be able to draw on our imagination, and you know, there is ultimately nothing wrong with saying like, oh, I really respect and am interested in that person's culture. Maybe I will use that as an inspiration, but don't include any specific details that belong to that. That way you'll avoid sending a message that you don't want to send. I promise you don't want to send those messages, especially if your attitude is like that you think nobody really practices these things anymore, or that it's okay to appropriate Native American cultures because you think they don't really exist in that form anymore. You don't really understand it. You don't really know, and it's not yours if you're not part of that culture. It's not yours to decide what's offensive and what's not. So I don't want to make this like a lecture on cultural sensitivity in your writing, but I think that should always be in the back of everybody's mind if you're using something that isn't yours as an inspiration. So going back to what I started with, having a Jewish character, do you even know what kosher is? Some people think it just means that you don't eat pork, but that's not what it means. That's not what it means at all. So if you're writing a character who keeps kosher, but you don't even know what that entails, you have at least some basic research to do. And that goes for anybody that you're writing about from a culture that you are not part of or not overly familiar with. So I guess I will end it there, and you can let me know if you have any questions, or also if you have any resources that you want to share with me. That would be great. I can always incorporate information into my online resources and link them in the info bar of this video for anyone who wants to know. And thank you again very much for watching. I'll see you guys next time.